Hello, everyone. This is a Walk for Change interview. My name is Bobby Rodrigo, and I'm your host. Walk the number 4 change.us. Why you walk for change is your own choice. It's about freedom of choice. Please check us out when you have a moment. Excited today, getting have a really good guest on, talking about subjects that are important to us. One of the things that I like a lot is people who are trying to make positive change in the world. Do what is good for your community and for people. I'm a fan of government accountability. I'm a fan of pointing out issues that are affecting you and I and our friends, family, and community. Politics are secondary to me when it comes to that at all times. I actually pretty much hate everybody in politics. And when I say that, I mean our elected officials and the way the government works for us, because they work against us in so many ways. So I stay out of those discussions, and I try to focus on what the community is about and what the issues are in our community. And my guest today is Thom Hartman. And you know him as a best-selling author. You know him as a four-time award-winning from Project Censored. He's authored, I believe, over 30 books, easy. And he's considered to be the number one progressive talk show host out there. And he wrote another book. He's got a series of books that he's doing about what he calls the hidden history. And we have talked previously about them. And the book today is The Hidden History of Monopolies, marvelous book. And without further ado, let me bring Thom in. Thom, great to see you. How you doing?
Hey, great to see you too. How are you, Bobby?
I'm good. I mentioned to you offline that I'm in Portland where you are, and it's been interesting here. I've spent time with inside the protest. I had to go take a peek. You know me, I always got to stick my nose in the front lines to see what's going on, because mainstream media tells us so much about the truth, as you know. But mainly I've been here working on some projects that actually tie into your recent book. I was just telling the audience about your latest pen, The Hidden History of Monopolies, an important subject. And I've been involved with the Coffee Party USA, which is actually how we met. Um, and the Coffee Party was founded on getting money out of politics, which is only part of this story. It's one of the reasons why it exists, but it's only part of this story. And so I'm really happy to talk about this issue with you. And first of all, how's things going? I mean, we're in a 2020 special. So how you doing?
Yeah, no, we're good. We're good.
Fantastic.
We've adapted. Thank God we've got a living space that's ours. I really, my heart breaks for the literally millions, probably tens of millions of people who are on the verge of eviction, and all around us. I'm constantly. Well, this morning, Louise and I went for a walk, and there was a guy sleeping in his car, and it was a brand new car. I'm guessing he lost his job, and well, God only knows. But it's just we're seeing this all around us.
Well, I don't know how long you've lived in Portland, but I'm learning. I lived in the Northwest previously, and I'm up here since July. And I was reminded about the homeless situation here even pre-COVID. And of course, that has expanded for some of the reasons that you've mentioned, of course. The city of Portland deals with their homeless in a lot more positive ways, I guess we could say, from the government standpoint, than many cities. I know that years ago that they actually were sending people on buses to come to Portland who were homeless, so they would get out of one city and they would come to the other because of the way they were treated, or whatever the politics was of that. Yep. But you are right. The eviction thing has been a concern of mine as well, relative to the food supply chain, which is being destroyed right now for many reasons. And actually, your book discusses big ag, which I want to get into with you. But so you're doing the hidden history. So I cover a little bit. Let's remind everybody why you're doing these series of books that you've been doing. I know we've already talked about, interviewed on some of the other ones. Just give a little brief on why you're doing it.
Since Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education, Bill Bennett, gutted civics education in the United States, there's a lot of people who really don't know that much about the history of the United States and how things got where they are. So the first book was about guns and the Second Amendment and why the Second Amendment was written the way it was when it was. The second book is about the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America and how the Supreme Court acquired the power it has and what a government might be able to do about that. And this relentless 40-year push, 50-year push really on the part of conservatives to take over the Supreme Court that seems to be reaching its peak right now. The third book is about the hidden history of the war on voting. It should be titled The Republican War on Voting. And the fourth and fifth books have to do with concentration, concentration specifically. This book on monopolies is about the concentration of wealth in corporate America. And the next book, which is, it's available now, but it doesn't ship until the spring, is The Hidden History of Oligarchy and Tyranny, how political power has been concentrated in the United States. So, we're trying to write small books, 30,000 words, more or less, 180 pages, 190 pages, a book you can read in a weekend, and that are packed full of information, no padding.
Yeah, and that has been refreshing. It's almost like a journalistic approach. That we have an integrity problem in journalism, as you know. Can you just tell us what happened? Just tell us what happened. Don't spin it, because we have that going on. So it's very refreshing in that regard. I know I've mentioned that to you before. I want to mention, and that's not this book, but because the Supreme Court is in our focus right now, I read something recently that has resonated with me, and it's a reminder of the oligarch, in my opinion. RGB was the only sitting justice, and of course, a rare situation. Like actually, I think the last one before her was Thurgood, that actually represented human beings as part of their resume. The every single person on the court today, and that I can't think of anybody since Thurgood, because Thurgood certainly represented human beings, has never ever represented a human being in a court proceeding. It's all been government or corporations, big business. That's their resume. And I thought the article was brilliant in bringing that point out, because I had forgotten, even what that means. And when you talk about civil rights, which of course the Supreme Court is supposed to be about, how do you even understand it if you've never been in court dealing with it? And of course, people can have, obviously we've had justices that do understand it that didn't do that, but it's got to be a harder bridge, in my opinion. And I just wanted to, I don't know if you had noticed that or not. I didn't until I read this article. I just wanted to get your view on that real quick before we dive into the new book.
Well, the court has, for a long, long time, been the most conservative branch of government. I think you could argue that with the exception of a couple of 10-year periods throughout the history of the United States, the court has been the most conservative branch of government, the most resistant to change, if you're defining conservative as that. And so it shouldn't surprise us that, when legislators and presidents are looking to put people on the court, they're going to look for people, even in the liberal realm, who come from a relatively conservative background, like a corporate background or a government lawyer background, as opposed to somebody who is a litigator or somebody who is a defense lawyer.
Yeah, it really goes all the way down when you think about it, because most people have seen the politics of when defense lawyers run for prosecutors, run for district attorney office from the elected position. And of course, they get destroyed politically because of the fact that they represented people constitutionally in an open forum as somehow being a strike against them for being a district attorney. It's an amazing thing to watch, and that's why most of them lose. We have seen some movement. I won't spend much more time on that. I had to get your input on that, because the RGB thing and the lack of human beings being involved with the justices is a thing. So getting into this, again, my work just with the Coffee Party, for example, has been all about money and politics, and this is way more than that. The monopoly business, it touches on so many fields that have moved. As you know, I'm not a label guy, right? It's about liberty, not liberty, and it's really the same thing. You mentioned the conservative, and you mentioned how the liberals are doing it too, which to me, it's a movement away from we the people for the most part of what you're talking about. A lot of this doesn't focus on what the people need, and for me, the two sides of the aisle is the government on one side being held accountable, and we the people on the other side being holding them to accountability for what's best for us. And obviously the politics are involved in that because of our nature of our government, but that's my personal approach. And when I see this, when I read this, I was pleased again with the, I guess the bluntness, I guess is the way that, it's clear what's going on. So tell me how you started the process, and you the introduction is cancer and the monopoly, and that's clearly why. So let's start there.
Well, a few years ago, I was in Germany visiting some friends that I used to work with, and we started talking about internet service and cell phone service. And I discovered that they were paying the U.S. equivalent of around $20 a month for their cell phone service, and I was paying, I think, $60. And they were paying around $25 a month for their internet service, and they had a full gigabit up and down. And I was paying $85 for 40 MIP service down and 5 MIP up on with Comcast. And I'm like, holy crap, I'm being ripped off. Are they? Is this normal for Europe, or is this just Germany? And they're like, yeah, this is normal. And it turns out that the reason why is because the European countries enforce their anti-monopoly laws. The United States is the only developed country in the world that doesn't. And that was a decision. England is just, the United Kingdom is slightly behind us in this, but for the same reason. Thatcher and Reagan. Thatcher came to power in the UK in '78. Reagan came to power in the United States in '81. They were both big believers that corporations should have more power than government, and they both proceeded to do that. Reagan most explicitly in '82, he announced that he was going to stop enforcing our antitrust laws, and that led to this explosion in the '80s. Ask anybody old enough to remember it, that it was called the M&A mania, mergers and acquisitions mania. And these guys who called themselves, like Michael Milken, refer to themselves as masters of the universe. They would take a half a dozen different companies in a particular sector and just basically jam them all together into one company, and then lay off or fire all of the redundant, now you have, one company instead of 6 companies. You don't need 6 HR departments. You don't need 6 marketing departments. You don't need 6 R&D companies. So they could shed 20% of the total workforce for this new company, sometimes as much as 40% of the workforce. And, it wipes out working people, but it makes more profit for the ownership class. And, that's what's going on.
Yeah, just, it's interesting you mentioned Reagan a lot, because it sounds like, for me, from the grassroots and being an advocate of so many things, St. Reagan is what woke me up and said, wait a minute.
This is where it began.
Yeah. He
Nixon was a crook, but Reagan was, was at least manipulated by ideologues.
He opened a lot of doors. I mean, if you just look at it from the military-industrial complex alone, how he exploded that. And then, of course, he brought religion into the White House in a way that hadn't been done, and I don't really know when. Those two things alone, what really spurred me from a grassroots standpoint was his handling of the AIDS epidemic and the treatment of people.
For 8 years, he refused to say the word AIDS out loud.
Totally. And meanwhile, an interesting thing about that for me was, I was in boot camp in 1980, and they taught us every actual factual aspect of the AIDS epidemic in boot camp, because I was in the Navy, and they protect you, from STDs. It's a big part of our indoctrination or training or whatever. We're going to travel the world. And to this day, I believe that representation that they gave us in boot camp is probably one of the best medically accurate things I've ever heard about the AIDS epidemic. Meanwhile, I'm watching what they're doing to our society about the same issue. And it's like, we're talking about a major hypocrisy. So Reagan is special, without a doubt. And so many of his people in his administration are still around.
Yes.
The other, which is the other, people just don't go away. So I have to tell you, and the the monopoly aspect, one of the reasons that I'm here in the Northwest is I'm involved and have been for a while relative to disaster relief and or just regular food security, is trying to show the world that it is the local food supply chain that works best and should be used all the time, and how bad big agriculture is for our country in so many ways. So when I read your book and I ran into the big ag part, I loved the fact that it was there because it was, very clear what you were saying, and I want to talk a little bit about that because I'm dealing with it, and the way that it shifted for us was COVID and the destruction of the independent restaurant world that's going on right now, and how farms are being impacted. So you start with monopoly in milk, and you lay out a story that the Kentucky farmer that was done in a documentary. So let's start there.
You're talking about the guy who ended up committing suicide?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this was in the 80s when Reagan said, we're not going to enforce the antitrust laws anymore. It wasn't just movie theaters and radio stations and hotels that started jamming together, and banks. It was also the big ag companies, in particular the companies that were the middlemen, the wholesalers, who basically controlled the agriculture market because farmers don't have a place to sell their products, they're screwed. And what these companies started doing was manipulating commodity prices. They by jamming these companies together so that we ended up with a small number of very, very large corporations, they were able to control commodity prices to the point that they were wiping out farmers across the Midwest. And as they were wiping out those farmers, the farmers were then then they would say to the farmer, okay, you're broke now, we'll buy your farm from you, no problem. You can continue to live in it, no problem. You pay us rent. And by the way, you can continue to work your fields, but we own the product. Basically they turned an entire generation of American Midwestern farmers into sharecroppers. Right. And Willie Nelson was trying to stop this with farm aid. And there was all these efforts, these civilian efforts, these average person efforts to try to save farmers and save and restore some diversity and integrity to our food supply. But none of them were successful ultimately.
No, and it developed even worse than that when you had the creation of Monsanto farms, for example. When you look to that and how now it's really, Monsanto has been a thorn in our world forever, and now it's owned by a pharmaceutical company. And
by Bayer out of Germany.
Yeah, you have Bayer owning that, and you have pharmaceutical and food together.
Good.
And
it should not.
It's amazing how stupid we are in that regard. Not trying to stop the obvious correlation, because food is health and big pharma is not, and of course big pharma is about as big a monopoly as you can get because it controls the healthcare industry. From the teaching standpoint, from obviously the pharmaceutical standpoint, we're not a healthcare, we're a sick care situation because it props up profits are so much so. Getting back, sorry to drift. It's so easy to drift in the monopoly world. It's another reason why I was looking forward to this interview, because it covers so much in our society. We have to point these things out. So staying with big ag. So what Monsanto did to me that was so criminal is that not only do you have, for example, the way you give the broker world and how they control the commodities and turn them into sharecroppers, but then Monsanto actually got into farming and then controlling the seed store. Right. So the monopoly is that it's in all aspects. You're going right to the dirt, essentially, and then the healthcare of the dirt as well. So I think that what you're discussing in big ag. So how do we fix that? I mean, what is the? I mean, I guess we're talking about the cure of it all, but how do we fix that?
Yeah, we went through this once before in our history. When the country was founded, we were founded basically in a battle against monopoly, the British East India Company, which controlled virtually all the trade between the United States and the rest of the world. And the Boston Tea Party was, an attempt to overthrow that company, and explicitly because they had just gotten this massive tax break from the British government, and they were using the money from that tax break to wipe out independent tea companies in the United States, or in the colonies back then.
Right, the colonies.
And so, we were birthed in a fight against monopoly, but we were a very agricultural country for the first 60, 70, 80 years. And it wasn't until the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s that the Industrial Revolution really started picking up steam. And we saw the rise of these oligarchic, monopolistic monsters, Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel or U.S. Steel or J.P. Morgan's banking empire, DuPont and chemicals, Dow and explosives. I mean, it's just they and every single one of them were controlling like 70, 80, 90% of markets locally or nationally. And at that point, first the state of Ohio and then the entire government in the late 1880s and early 1890s said, okay, we need an immune system for this. We need some way to restrain monopoly, because monopoly is to cancer is to capitalism what cancer is to our bodies. It's when a small group of cells or a small group of companies decide we're going to take everything. Right. And it's just as destructive to capitalism as cancer is to the body. And so in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt started enforcing the Sherman Act of 1890, and William Howard Taft finished the job. The next, these back-to-back two progressive Republican presidents, the last progressive Republican presidents, and and we still had the antitrust laws. I mean, the last major antitrust enforcement in the United States was started by Richard Nixon, breaking up AT&T. The job was finished by Jimmy Carter.
My sister worked for them. I remember it very well. My sister Marilyn worked there. I was, for Nixon, I was as young as you were. And I remember it well, just from the standpoint of my older sister working for New York Bell Telephone and the whole divestiture thing. Absolutely.
Yeah. So when Reagan stopped enforcing that, what happened was we kind of slid back to where we were in 1905 when Teddy Roosevelt decided he was going to take on these people. And I think, in answer to your specific question, what do we do about this? We break up these giant corporations. We have not had a president since Reagan who was willing to say, we're going to start enforcing the laws that are on the books again. And it's time.
Yeah, and that is a really good point. I suppose, just to echo some of the things I always say is I hate everybody, because for me, the elected officials are not doing their job for the people. And I think you just gave a really good example. Just in our last special 4 years, draining the swamp, and then the previous 8 of hope and change. So I just tell myself, I'm waiting for hope and change so I can drain the swamp, type of thing.
Yeah.
I could be, because it's really important, and you mentioned something about how it hurts capitalism, and that's something I think needs to be highlighted here, because it goes across the board. When I talk about capitalism with anybody, I'm a free market guy, and when I talk about capitalism with anybody, today we don't have an example of it existing in our society, true capitalism, to even say works, because what we have is cronyism and monopolies. And I wanted to get your view on that specific point. I really believe that when I hear the arguments about capitalism, pro, con, whatever, that we don't have an example up there that is happening today to even have a true debate about it because of monopolies.
Well, the meaning of the word, just like the meaning of the word socialism, is all over the map in the United States.
True. We've been hijacking words. Yeah.
Right. I don't think that we're ever, no matter how much we may talk about, doing away with capitalism, all that, short of doing what Lenin did. I mean, short of literally privatizing, or making public, having the government seize all private property or all major private property, which I don't know anybody who advocates. Short of doing that, I don't see how you destroy capitalism. Capitalism has been around for a long, long time in a whole variety of forms, arguably 7,000 years, although in its modern form, it's only 200 or 300 years old. But I think that just like, the metaphor that I used earlier of the body and cancer, our immune systems every day are catching cancerous cells in our bodies and destroying them. In capitalism, the immune system is the regulation that limits corporate behavior to benign behaviors, that stops the cancerous behaviors of corporations. And that's largely the antitrust laws. Yeah, there's others as well, but, purposes of this discussion. And, and that's why we need to go back to enforcing them.
Yeah, I agree. And so I have to tell everybody, so, these books that Thom are doing are refreshing in in their clarity and in their accuracy. I probably should say accuracy first, because like you mentioned, the hijacking of our words. We have a plethora of words that are being sustainable. I'm afraid to use it in a discussion just because it opens up an art or puts a label, and that's what they're doing to us. They're keeping us so divided. They're making so much money off of our arguments and division. I was a good colleague of mine is here in Portland, for example, and he does raw footage news work on the ground, independent journalism. And his work is phenomenal, and he just won an Emmy actually for a documentary. And I'm just happened yesterday, just reading the stream, and it's amazing how hateful people are without just behind the keyboard, and they're keeping us that way, and they're making a lot of money off of us, which is another monopoly. Well, I'll close with this. You mentioned the cancer of the Fox News. I want to touch a little bit about that, because it's really not just it's not necessarily an attack on a particular station, as it is about how our media is operating, which is so important. And just talk a little bit about what our media is doing in the monopoly world, please.
Well, we used to have diversity in our media. When I started in radio in 1966, I think it was, I was 15. I had a weekend job as a country western DJ, and it was in a station that had been started about 8 or 10 years before. By 3 middle-class guys, an old radio guy and an old radio engineer, and a sales guy. And they put it together and started this radio station. And over the next 10, 12 years, I worked for 4 or 5 other stations in Lansing, Michigan, and the TV station. And every single one of them was locally owned. They were all owned by local families or local people or groups of local people. Today, there's not a single locally owned station, to the best of my knowledge, in the Lansing market. And that's true all over the country. When Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act of '96, they blew up these rules that limited ownership of radio and television stations and newspapers, so that we wouldn't have another sort of William Randolph Hearst, a media mogul who had the power to influence political discourse, as it were. And since then, we've seen, just this. I mean, Clear Channel went from being a small regional company within a year and a half or 2 years of Clinton signing that law, went from being a small regional company to owning over 1,000 radio stations and putting right-wing talk radio on a lot of them. And and we saw the same thing with Cumulus, and so it's just the whole media landscape has been heavily monopolized, and the result of that is that it's been turned into right-wing land.
And that's worldwide now. When we think about the media ownership of everything,
it depends on the country, but yeah.
True. Yeah. I mean, you have the.
But Rupert Murdoch. I mean, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, wrote a brilliant piece last year for the Sydney Morning Herald titled "Rupert Murdoch is the cancer at the heart of Australian democracy," and he talked about how Murdoch destroyed Australia, and then he moved to the UK, and he destroyed the UK, and then he moved to the US, and he's in the process of destroying the United States. And I'm using that. Well, I'm not sure he used the word destroy, but his language is extremely strong in this piece, and it's and that's what happened.
Yeah, I look forward to reading it. But Thom, as always, it's a pleasure. I look forward to reading your next release, of course, and having you back on and talking more about these important subjects. As always. Yeah, absolutely. As always, you're out there trying to make the world a better place, and I love it. I love it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me with you.
Absolutely. You have a marvelous rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
So, Thom Hartman, just in closing, it is important. Facts are important, and we hear that all the time because it's missed what the facts really are. Do your research. Thom mentioned something early in the interview about civics being lost. And I remember Mr. Bennett. He was special. Again, I am not a fan of our elected officials. We talked specifically about Reagan, for example, and we talked about some of the other people. And for me, they stopped working for us a long time ago. In my adult life, which pretty much started with Reagan, I just don't see it. I see lies, I see deception, I see power grabs, I see I see a situation that is created that doesn't allow for the opportunities to be reached by everybody possible, which is what this country is supposed to be about, is about on paper anyway. All right, so everybody stay safe. We know it's a crazy world out there. You know, do what you got to do, make smart decisions, you know, and walk for change. Thank you for joining me.